What happens when the most powerful city in the world starts leaving entire parts of itself behind? Along New York's waterfront, silence has replaced motion, and almost nobody wants to talk about why. For decades, ports and piers were the physical proof that New York was alive, connected, indispensable. Goods moved, people worked, systems functioned. Today, some of those same structures sit empty, locked or half-decaying, facing the water like monuments to a promise that quietly expired. No dramatic collapse, no breaking news emergency, just absence, and absence in cities is never accidental. What makes this unsettling isn't just that these ports are empty, it's that they are still there, maintained enough to avoid scandal, ignored enough to avoid responsibility. They exist in a strange limbo, too visible to deny, too inconvenient to explain. This is how structural crises actually begin, not with explosions or riots, but with infrastructure that slowly stops being useful while everyone pretends it's temporary. New York sells itself as a machine that never stops, but machines don't rust in silence unless someone lets them. These piers were designed for movement, coordination, logistics, and economic flow. When they go quiet, it signals something deeper than a shift in trade routes. It signals a breakdown in priorities, where image matters more than function and symbolism replaces service. Walk near these waterfronts, and you don't feel decline in a dramatic way. You feel it psychologically, a strange emptiness, a sense that the city is no longer built for participation, only observation. Fences, locked gates, warning signs. Infrastructure that once connected the city to the world now acts as a barrier, reminding residents of what no longer belongs to them. And this is where the illusion cracks. Because while officials talk about revitalization, resilience, and growth, entire logistical arteries sit idle, not repurposed, not repaired, just paused indefinitely. That pause is expensive. It drains resources, distorts planning, and quietly accelerates exclusion. When systems stop working for ordinary life, cities don't adapt, they harden. These empty piers aren't failures of engineering. They're failures of acknowledgement. Admitting they matter would require admitting that something fundamental is slipping, that New York's complexity is becoming unmanageable, that maintenance is replacing progress, that the city is investing more in preserving its reputation than in preserving functionality. And here's the uncomfortable truth most people avoid. Once infrastructure becomes symbolic instead of practical, the collapse is already underway. It just hasn't announced itself yet. The waterfront is only the first place where the silence is loud enough to hear, if you're willing to listen. Because the real question isn't why these ports are empty. It's what other systems have already stopped working while everyone is still applauding. The skyline. Before we move forward, pause for a moment. Because understanding what you're seeing here matters more than just watching another video about New York. These empty piers aren't trivia, they're signals. And signals only mean something if people are willing to recognize them. If this perspective is already challenging the image you were sold about the city, let me know in the comments. I want you to write exactly what crossed your mind when you realized that silence, not chaos, is how urban collapse actually begins. Even a single sentence matters here. If this analysis is helping you see the city differently, beyond marketing, beyond headlines, leave a like. It tells the algorithm that long-form, uncomfortable truths still deserve space. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. This channel exists to expose what gets normalized, ignored, or quietly hidden in modern cities. And what's coming next? Now that we've exposed the silence along the waterfront, the next question is unavoidable. What happens when infrastructure no longer serves people but still drains the city's energy? Infrastructure is supposed to be invisible when it works. You don't notice ports, transit systems, or logistical corridors when they serve their purpose. They fade into the background of daily life. But in New York, something has flipped. Entire structures remain standing, funded, and guarded, yet they no longer serve the people who live around them. They exist without function, and that's where the real damage begins. An empty pier is not neutral. It still consumes resources. It still shapes zoning decisions, security budgets, maintenance contracts, and long-term planning. But instead of enabling movement, jobs, or access, it becomes a frozen asset, one that benefits no one except the illusion of continuity. This is what happens when cities stop being designed for living and start being managed for appearances. The deeper issue isn't abandonment. It's misalignment. New York saw infrastructure was built for a version of the city that no longer exists, yet authorities keep pretending that minor adjustments will bring it back. Meanwhile, everyday life becomes harder. Transportation strains increase. Supply chains reroute inefficiently. Neighborhoods near these dormant structures stagnate, not because of crime or decay, but because nothing is allowed to happen there anymore. This creates a subtle but powerful form of exclusion. When infrastructure stops serving people, it doesn't fail loudly, it narrows access. Public space becomes restricted space, utility becomes liability, and residents learn slowly that the city is no longer responsive to their needs. It's responsive to balance sheets, optics, and long-term bets that never seem to arrive. There's also a psychological toll most discussions ignore. Living near useless infrastructure sends a constant signal. This place is no longer meant to work for you. You're surrounded by reminders that systems exist above your participation. That feeling erodes trust, patience, and belonging. People don't just leave cities because they're expensive, they leave because the city stops feeling alive. And here's the uncomfortable pivot. Once infrastructure loses its role in daily life, it becomes a tool of delay. Problems are postponed instead of solved. Repairs are justified without rethinking purpose. Redevelopment plans circulate for years without execution. The city appears active while remaining stuck. This isn't stagnation, it's controlled inertia. What's happening along New York's waterfront isn't isolated, it's a pattern. Infrastructure without function spreads quietly, normalizing inefficiency and training residents to accept less while paying more. And once that expectation sets in, reversing it becomes nearly impossible. Because the next phase isn't repair, it's repurposing without consent. And that's where the human cost accelerates. At one point, New York's ports were not just infrastructure. They were proof of relevance. They were the city's bloodstream. Every container, every shipment, every coordinated movement reinforced the idea that New York was indispensable to global circulation. When those spaces fall silent, the loss is not only economic, it's symbolic. And symbols matter more than officials like to admit. What replaces an active port isn't simply emptiness. It's a kind of urban ghosting. The structures remain, the outlines are familiar, but the purpose has evaporated. These areas start to feel detached from time, as if they belong to a version of the city that no longer exists. That disconnect creates an unsettling question. If places this central can become irrelevant, what else is quietly losing its function? This transition didn't happen overnight. It wasn't caused by a single policy failure or market shock. It unfolded gradually, hidden behind modernization narratives, logistical upgrades, and vague promises of future redevelopment. But beneath the language, something fundamental changed. The city stopped organizing itself around movement and started organizing itself around control, liability management, and image preservation. When a logistical heart turns into a dead zone, ripple effects spread outward. Jobs don't disappear dramatically, they thin out. Small operations vanish first, then specialized labor. Then the supporting ecosystem that once justified nearby housing, services, and transit connections. The neighborhood doesn't collapse, it hollows. And hollowing is harder to detect than destruction. What makes this especially dangerous is how easy it is to normalize. Residents adapt, commuters reroute, planners reframe the absence as underutilization instead of failure. The city learns to function around the void instead of addressing it. That adaptation is often praised as resilience, but in reality, it's a quiet surrender to decline. There's also a psychological distortion at work. A city that once thrived on purpose begins to feel performative. Spaces exist to be photographed, branded, or theorized. not used. The port becomes scenery, the pier becomes a backdrop, and when urban life turns into a stage set, the people living inside it start to feel interchangeable, temporary, expendable. This is where the crisis accelerates. Because once function is replaced by symbolism, decision-making becomes detached from lived experience. Investments prioritize perception. Maintenance replaces transformation. And the city keeps signaling strength while slowly losing the systems that made it strong in the first place. The haunting part isn't that these ports stopped working. It's that the city learned to live without them and pretended nothing was lost. Before we move on, leave a comment with the words ghost infrastructure if this shift feels familiar to you, even outside New York. New York built its global identity on a single, relentless promise. This is the city that never sleeps. Constant. Motion. Endless opportunity. A place where energy itself feels permanent. But that myth depends on one fragile condition. Everything has to keep moving. And when parts of the city fall silent, the illusion doesn't just weaken, it fractures. What's unsettling about empty piers and dormant waterfronts isn't that they exist, it's where they exist. These are not marginal zones on the edge of the map. They sit inside the symbolic core of the city's story. When places designed for nonstop activity become quiet, they expose a contradiction the branding can't cover. The city is no longer operating at the pace it claims. The silence isn't dramatic. There are no alarms, no official acknowledgements, just stretches of space where nothing happens, day after day, while the rest of the city performs urgency. That contrast creates cognitive dissonance. A city that markets itself as alive at all hours now contains areas where time feels frozen, and frozen systems don't signal pause, they signal loss of direction. This is where the myth of constant vitality starts to fail psychologically. Residents absorb the message subconsciously. If even New York has dead zones, then the promise of perpetual momentum was never real. It was conditional, temporary. And once people internalize that, their relationship with the city changes. They stop seeing it as a place that carries them forward and start seeing it as a place that extracts energy without replenishing it. The danger isn't just symbolic. When the idea of nonstop function collapses, tolerance for dysfunction rises. Delays feel normal. Broken systems feel expected. Empty infrastructure becomes background noise. And once that normalization sets in, decline no longer needs to be hidden. It simply needs to be reframed as the new rhythm of the city. This reframing is powerful. It allows leaders to speak about vibrancy while managing stagnation. It lets investors focus on selective growth while ignoring structural decay. And it trains residents to accept that some parts of the city are no longer meant to work, only to exist. What's most revealing is how quickly the myth adjusts. The city doesn't admit it's slowed down. It redefines what movement means. Tourism, spectacle, and surface-level activity replace deep functionality. The city looks busy, sounds busy, feels busy, until you step into one of these quiet zones and realize how much has already shut down. That's when the question shifts. Not whether New York still moves, but who it's moving for now. At the end of this section, write "The city slowed first" in the comments. If you felt this contradiction between image and reality. When people talk about being pushed out of New York, the focus usually lands on rent, taxes, or wages that can't keep up. But long before residents pack boxes or leave the city, something more subtle happens. The infrastructure around them starts to fail quietly, and that failure sends a message. This place is no longer designed for you to stay. Empty piers and idle ports play a hidden no this process. They don't just signal economic shifts, they reshape daily life. Jobs disappear in fragments, services thin out, transit connections lose priority. Entire neighborhoods become harder to justify living in, not because they collapse, but because they stop functioning smoothly. That friction accumulates, pushing people out without ever issuing an eviction notice. This is how displacement works in advanced cities. It's rarely abrupt. It's layered. Infrastructure degrades first, opportunity follows, and only then do residents leave. By the time the exodus becomes visible, the decision was made years earlier, by systems, not individuals. People don't abandon cities. Cities quietly abandon people. What makes this process especially cruel is its invisibility. There's no villain, no single policy to point at, just a slow withdrawal of investment, attention, and care. Residents feel it as exhaustion, as constant adjustment, as the sense that living normally requires more effort every year. Eventually, staying feels like resistance, and leaving feels like relief. This is why empty infrastructure matters so much. It's not neutral space waiting for revival. It's a warning stage, a signal that the city has chosen to maintain appearance over usability. Once that choice is made, the city becomes hostile not through aggression, but through neglect. And neglect is harder to protest against. There's also a psychological shift that often goes unnoticed. When people live near structures that no longer serve a purpose, they internalize instability. They stop planning long-term. They hesitate to invest emotionally or financially in a place that feels temporary. This accelerates turnover, weakens communities, and reinforces the very decline authorities claim to be managing. By the time luxury redevelopment enters the conversation, the original population is already gone, or ready to leave. Displacement didn't start with new buildings. It started with silence, inefficiency, and systems that slowly stopped responding. The city didn't push people out. It made staying irrational. Living next to broken systems doesn't just change how a city functions. It changes how people think, feel, and perceive their own place within it. The psychological cost of urban abandonment is rarely measured, but it may be the most corrosive consequence of all. When infrastructure decays in plain sight, it sends a constant, silent message. Nothing here is guaranteed anymore. In neighborhoods near empty piers and inactive ports, residents are surrounded by reminders that the city's promises are conditional. Fences, locked gates, warning signs, unused docks, these aren't neutral visuals. They create a background anxiety that seeps into daily life. Even without words, the environment communicates uncertainty. Over time, that uncertainty becomes emotional fatigue. People begin to lower expectations without realizing it. Delays feel normal. Inefficiency feels inevitable. The idea that systems should work starts to sound naive. This psychological adaptation is often mislabeled as resilience, but in reality, it's a form of learned resignation. The city doesn't need to explain its failures anymore. Residents explain them to themselves. There's also a deep erosion of trust, not just in institutions, but in the city as a living system. When infrastructure stands unused yet guarded, people sense that decisions are being made elsewhere by forces that don't require their participation. This detachment breeds cynicism. Why engage? Why care? Why believe improvement is possible when decay is clearly being managed, not fixed? This emotional distance has social consequences. Communities fragment, people retreat inward, public spaces lose their meaning as shared environments and become mere passageways. When urban life stops offering a sense of continuity, residents stop investing emotionally in each other. The city becomes a place to endure, not inhabit. What's particularly damaging is how normalized this state becomes. New generations grow up assuming that parts of the city simply don't work. That abandonment is expected. That stress is the baseline. When dysfunction becomes familiar, it stops triggering outrage, and that's when decline accelerates the fastest. The irony is that none of this feels dramatic while it's happening. There's no single breaking point, just a steady erosion of confidence, belonging, and emotional security. The city still looks impressive from a distance, but from within, it feels hollowed out, functional enough to survive, but not enough to feel whole. This is the invisible cost of empty infrastructure. Not the rust or the lost revenue, but the quiet reshaping of how millions of people experience their own lives inside the city. At the end of this section, tell me in the comments if you've ever felt this emotional withdrawal from a place you once believed in. Use the phrase urban fatigue if this resonates. What allows all of this to continue isn't lack of awareness. It's denial, structured, institutional, and carefully maintained. Cities like New York don't collapse because leaders are uninformed. They collapse because admitting the scale of dysfunction threatens too many narratives at once. So instead, silence becomes policy. Empty piers are never officially described as failures. They're labeled under review, awaiting redevelopment, or temporarily underutilized. Language is used as insulation. By avoiding direct acknowledgement, authorities transform decay into a planning abstraction, something that exists on paper, not in lived reality. The problem isn't solved, it's postponed indefinitely. This is how normalization sets in. When nothing is declared broken, nothing needs urgent repair. Residents are trained slowly to stop expecting resolution. Years pass, press releases cycle, consultants rotate, and the infrastructure remains exactly where it was, unused, fenced off, quietly deteriorating. The city learns to function around the dysfunction instead of confronting it. What's most revealing is how public attention is redirected. Instead of addressing systemic breakdown, focus shifts to isolated distractions, new attractions, surface-level improvements, symbolic investments meant to signal momentum. These projects don't fix the system, they mask its failure. The city looks busy enough to avoid hard questions. There's also a cultural component to this denial. In a city defined by ambition, admitting decline feels like betrayal. Residents internalize the idea that pointing out dysfunction is pessimistic or disloyal. So silence spreads socially, not just politically. People notice the decay but hesitate to name it out loud. This creates a dangerous feedback loop. Authorities interpret public quiet as acceptance. Residents interpret official silence as inevitability. And between those two interpretations, nothing moves. The system freezes, not because no one sees the problem, but because everyone pretends it's manageable. Eventually, the abnormal becomes routine. Closed spaces feel permanent. Broken systems feel structural. The idea that the city could function differently starts to sound unrealistic. That's when decline stops being a phase and becomes a condition. And here's the critical shift. Once denial stabilizes decay, collapse no longer needs momentum. It sustains itself. For decades, New York has functioned as the showroom of the American promise. Opportunity, mobility, success, compressed into a skyline and exported to the world as proof that the system works. But showrooms are designed to impress from the outside, not to reveal what's failing behind the walls. And today, cracks are no longer hidden. They're just being reframed. Empty ports and idle piers expose a city that still looks powerful, but no longer operates coherently. To outsiders, New York remains iconic. To those inside it, the city increasingly feels selective, extractive, and unstable. This gap between image and lived reality is where the illusion collapses. Not suddenly, but irreversibly. The waterfront should represent connection, trade, movement, openness. Instead, it now reflects isolation. Barriers replace access. Maintenance replaces purpose. Spaces exist to be seen, not used. The city becomes a backdrop for consumption rather than a system that supports daily life. This is what happens when a place prioritizes being admired over being livable. What makes New York's case especially revealing is its global role. When smaller cities decline, it's dismissed as local failure. When New York shows the same symptoms, underused infrastructure, exclusion, psychological fatigue, it signals something systemic. The model itself is weakening, and no amount of branding can compensate for structural decay. The illusion persists because it's profitable. Real estate narratives, tourism, campaigns, and prestige investments depend on maintaining the myth. But myths don't need to function. They only need to circulate. Meanwhile, residents absorb the cost, financially, emotionally, socially. The city grows richer in perception while becoming poorer in experience. There's a moment when people stop believing entirely. They still live there, still work there, still post photos. But internally, the promise is gone. New York becomes something to survive, not aspire to. That quiet disillusionment spreads faster than any headline, and it's far more damaging. This is the real fracture point. Not when cities fail dramatically, but when they succeed only as images. When the dream becomes a performance, and the city beneath it can no longer support the lives that sustain it. Urban collapse rarely looks like collapse. That's the mistake most people make when trying to identify it. They expect disorder, violence, or sudden breakdowns. But in cities like New York, decline doesn't arrive explosively. It accumulates, slowly, bureaucratically, almost politely. Empty piers don't trigger emergencies, they trigger adjustments. Budgets are reallocated, timelines are extended, access is restricted. Each individual decision feels minor, reasonable, even temporary. But together, they form a pattern of managed decay. Nothing breaks all at once. Everything just works a little less each year. This gradualism is dangerous because it feels stable. Residents adapt to longer commutes, higher costs, fewer services, more friction. What once felt unacceptable becomes normal. And normalization is the most effective accelerator of decline. Once people expect less, systems are free to deliver less. The city itself becomes layered with inefficiencies that no one remembers choosing. Underused infrastructure coexists with overcrowded alternatives. Redundancy disappears. Flexibility vanishes. Systems become brittle, not because they're overwhelmed, but because they've been optimized for optics instead of resilience. This is why collapse in advanced cities is so difficult to reverse. There's no single failure to fix, no clear moment to intervene. The damage is distributed across years of small compromises, each one defensible in isolation, each one disastrous in accumulation. What makes this especially unsettling is how it hides responsibility. There's no clear villain, no dramatic policy to overturn. Decline becomes structural, embedded in processes rather than decisions. And when collapse is procedural, accountability dissolves. The Waterfront illustrates this perfectly. The silence isn't accidental. It's the outcome of countless choices to delay, defer, and disguise. The city didn't fall. It thinned. And thinning is harder to notice than breaking. By the time the consequences become undeniable, the systems needed to reverse them are already weakened. That's when cities cross a threshold, not into chaos, but into permanent fragility. Empty ports and silent piers don't just reflect what New York has lost, they preview what many modern cities are becoming. These spaces act like early warning systems, not because they're dramatic, but because they reveal where complexity has outgrown control. When a city can no longer maintain its own arteries, it starts rerouting life away from itself. What the Waterfront shows is a future defined less by collapse and more by exclusion. Cities that remain visually impressive but operationally brittle. Places where access shrinks while costs rise. Where infrastructure exists, but only for select functions, select groups, select narratives. The city doesn't disappear, it narrows. This narrowing has consequences that extend far beyond logistics. Housing becomes more speculative than functional. Mobility becomes more stressful than empowering. Public space becomes regulated, conditional, temporary, and everyday life starts to feel like a negotiation instead of a baseline. The city no longer absorbs pressure. It transfers it directly to residents. What's especially troubling is how transferable this model is. New York isn't an exception. It's a prototype. Other cities watch, learn, and replicate the same strategies. Delay maintenance, preserve image, normalize underperformance, manage decline instead of preventing it. The result is a generation of cities that look global but feel fragile. And here's the final shift most people miss. Once cities stop prioritizing function, they stop being adaptable. They can't respond to shocks. They can't pivot meaningfully. Every disruption becomes existential because there's no slack left in the system. Empty infrastructure isn't just wasted space, it's lost capacity. The future being signaled here isn't one of sudden ruin, it's one of permanent tension. Cities that demand constant effort just to remain livable. Places where staying requires endurance, not belonging. Where the question isn't, why did this city fail, but why does it still pretend it hasn't? The Piers are quiet now, but what they're announcing is anything but silent. If you stayed until the end, you already understand something most people avoid facing. This wasn't just a video about empty piers or abandoned ports. It was about how modern cities quietly stop working while pretending nothing is wrong. If this analysis helped you see New York, or any major city, with clearer eyes, subscribe to the channel now. This space exists to expose what gets normalized, ignored, and disguised as progress. Liking the video tells the algorithm that deep, uncomfortable analysis still matters. And I want you to leave a comment. Write this exact phrase. The collapse was quiet. That tells me you didn't just watch, you understood. Now don't stop here. The next video appearing on your screen goes even deeper into how modern urban systems fail people long before they fail on paper. Watch it carefully.